Hey guys, welcome to the Texas Blockcast. I'm hosting today Lee Bratcher, president of the TBC. We have Zach Edwards with us. Zach is a member of the TBC. He is an ambassador for Polkadot, the largest DAO in the world, which is an interesting fact that I like to throw out when talking about with Zach. And he's going to go through today. We're going to just talk a little bit about his background, but it's going to be a little bit more educational. He's going to be educating me and you, by extension, the audience, about sort of the details of how Polkadot works from a governance perspective, all the way to probably some technical stuff too. But before we dive into all that, Zach, thanks for being on the show, and tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me. I first got into crypto early 2018, kind of right when smart contracts were getting started on Ethereum. So some of that early activity, but then really sort of fully dove in about 3 years ago. Got into the Polkadot ecosystem, started learning about the tech and thinking. I always try to think on like a 5 to 10 year time horizon for, where do I want to invest my time and resources. And so looking at future-proof tech, really building for the future, and Polkadot really stood out to me. So dove in, sort of just got involved in the community, started writing kind of educational articles about it, got some tips from the Polkadot Treasury for doing that, and then segued that into a content role at Subsocial, which was project building on Polkadot at the time. So that's what I've done for about the last 2.5 years. And then a couple months ago, put in a Treasury proposal to have Polkadot partner with Texas Blockchain Council as a sponsor, and for me to work with them to advance Polkadot in the U.S., work on policy initiatives and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's right. And it's a fascinating process, right? When we normally have a member come on, it's pretty typical corporate member joining TBC. We get approval from the right authorities, and then we work with folks. But in this case, there was a vote over the course of probably a week or more, maybe it was a couple weeks, where DOT token holders were voting on whether the Polkadot would join the TBC. And before the vote even started, we had to put in our public address for a wallet, so that if the measure passed, the Treasury would then automatically disperse the membership dues to the TBC, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah.
Cool process.
Yeah, it took about 3 weeks, but it was pretty much a 99% aye vote the whole time, which was great to see.
I know. I was surprised it was so high. But let's dive in now a little bit to the ecosystem. I think our listeners will be familiar that we typically don't go very far down into alternate layer ones, into altcoins. But obviously with Polkadot, we're making an exception just because of the level of decentralization that you guys have achieved is quite impressive. And so we're excited to have you guys on board. And just so that y'all know, we don't accept, we turn down members to the TBC based upon certain criteria. And so just kind of wanted to throw that disclaimer out there that Polkadot has achieved a level of decentralization that's not common for many of their other competitors or peers in the programmable blockchain space. So Zach, you can share your screen if you want. You can kind of take the reins, and I'm going to interject questions as we go here, so that if I feel like the audience or even myself will have a question, I'm going to throw it in there.
All right, yeah, sounds good. So I've got a presentation, so if you're just listening, I'll try to explain everything. So let's talk about Polkadot, which is, you can kind of think of as a world computer. And a lot of blockchains might kind of claim this title, but we'll see how Polkadot is really positioning itself to be the most world computer of them all, so to speak. So first we'll look at the founding of Polkadot, kind of the history, how we got here. Then why Polkadot? What advantages does it have? Why does the world actually need it? Why should anybody choose Polkadot over some other option? We'll touch on governance. Polkadot has pretty much the best on-chain governance in the world at the moment. We'll finish up with looking at the ecosystem and some final Q&A. So around 10 years ago, the Ethereum white paper was published. This was written by Vitalik Buterin, who you're probably familiar with. This was kind of the ideas, and then the actual technical implementation was described in the yellow paper, which was written by Dr. Gavin Wood. The story goes that Gavin basically created the EVM, the Ethereum virtual machine, in a week or two. The EVM is what allows for smart contracts to be created and used, actual programmability on chain as opposed to just balance transfers. But Gavin figured out pretty quick that Ethereum wasn't going to scale very well. You can only fit so many transactions in a block, and so you'll run out of space eventually. So the most common way to scale things in technology these days is parallelization. Modern processors have multiple cores, which allow them to do multiple things at the same time. So you can think of this if you go somewhere, there might be multiple workers, so they can do more work in the same amount of time. So parallelization in terms of blockchains is basically just having multiple blockchains, so you can essentially have more transaction throughput. So with the Polkadot SDK, this is a modular framework for building blockchains with the aim to have a multi-chain future as a way to scale. And then Gavin was thinking, okay, well, if we'll have multiple chains, we basically have two options. One is to have all of them be sort of general purpose jack of all trades chains like Ethereum, or we can go down the specialization route, which is what we really see in the real world. People specialize in a specific niche, they get better at it, more efficient, and then people can trade, work together, and ultimately it's a better outcome for everybody. However, the key point, if you have multiple chains, is to have them all under a shared security umbrella so that they can communicate much easier with each other. Obviously, if you have specialization, it's only really good if people can trade, communicate, talk to each other. And different blockchains with their own security and consensus algorithms for them to talk to each other. There's we have these modern bridges which are slow and expensive and they get hacked a lot. It's not great. But by having everything under a shared security umbrella, it allows these chains to talk much faster, the security is much higher, and you need a lot less trust. The sort of Web3 motto that Dr. Gavin Wood has coined is less trust and more truth. And we have this code where we can just look at the code and see the truth, so we should use that instead of having to trust that centralized things are working how we think they should be. So in 2016, they published the Polkadot white paper, which was kind of outlining this whole meta protocol, so to speak, for building this ecosystem that will support multiple specialized chains under a shared security umbrella. And Polkadot 1.0 was finally released last year, although Polkadot itself has been live since 2020 already. So what actually is Polkadot? Here's a great image representing it. If you're just listening, kind of hard to describe. We basically have a ring, and then there's a bunch of little things connected around the outside of the ring. So the ring itself is what we call the Polkadot relay chain. Usually when we talk about Polkadot, we're talking about the Polkadot ecosystem, but we do also need to specify the Polkadot relay chain. So this is essentially the hub of the wheel. This is the chain where the dot token lives. And this relay chain provides security for the entire ecosystem. Now around the outside, we have all of these other specialized chains. We call them parachains, but you can also think of them as app chains, rollups, layer 2s, or layer 1s really. So all of these different chains, they essentially sit on top of Polkadot, and when transactions happen on these parachains, they take those transactions and they put them together in a block, but they don't actually validate the block. They send the block to Polkadot, and then Polkadot does the validation. So that right there is another example of specialization where the relay chain specializes in just validating blocks, and the parachains don't need to worry about that. Now, by having this this model here, where all of these parachains sit on top of the Polkadot relay chain, it allows them to communicate with each other very well. So all of these pink lines inside the ring here, you can think of these as just a visualization for these different parachains communicating.
Zach,
So
let me just jump in
go
here
ahead, Lee.
with kind of a question that I had. And first of all, for the audience, if you are just listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you're probably gonna wanna watch this one on YouTube. So just go to our YouTube channel, take a watch. Um, that I think the imagery is really effective here. But Zach, remind me as far as like the nodes on the inner circle there. How are those selected, and how many nodes are there again?
So there's 297 validators. These are selected through a nominated proof of stake system. So token holders, they can stake their dot and earn, it varies. Right now it's somewhere around 15% per year, which I think is one of the highest native staking yields in crypto. And then you can nominate multiple validators at the same time. There's I believe it's called Fragment, kind of this complex algorithm for which ones actually get selected. So it does change sometimes, but we have 297 validators globally distributed, which I believe is higher than most other chains.
And does it work similar to Ethereum where there's like slashing if a validator has
Yeah, so there's incentives and disincentives in that sense that, yeah, you can get slashed if someone is acting up.
okay. Okay, cool. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no problem. So here's kind of an image representing what we think of as Polkadot 1.0. This word core here, you can kind of think of this as a slot, and a parachain takes up a slot. We recently switched to using cores as terminology, thinking, kind of in reference to computer processors where you have multiple cores that let you do multiple things. So each one of these parachains has occupied a core. The way they got access to a core was we had auctions essentially, and the highest bidder would get the core for 96 weeks. So every block in that core they would have access to. The auction wasn't actually paying for it; it was just locking up DOT. So it still has a cost in that you can't stake the DOT. So essentially, the missed staking rewards was the cost for this. But we had this auction, and community members could contribute as well. But this model has a lot of problems in that, if you get every single block in this core for 96 weeks, if you don't actually need all of the blocks, maybe you don't have that much activity, then you're essentially overpaying, which isn't good. On the other hand, if you're filling up every single block, there isn't a way to get access to more cores. You can't scale past that limit. So we are introducing Polkadot 2.0, which is in the process of rolling out right now. I'll come back to this image in just a second. But Polkadot 2.0 is comprised of 3 major upgrades, which are a little technical but important for the evolving Polkadot into really being a place for businesses to build. So the first of those is agile core time, which essentially means that you can buy as much or as little time with these cores as you need. So before, where you had to buy a whole 2 years, even if you're only using, every other block maybe. Now, if you only need a block every 30 seconds, then you can just buy one block every 30 seconds. So you're not overpaying for this essentially wasted resource, this empty block space. But also, if you need to scale and you need more block space, more cores, because you have so much transactions happening, you are able to do that. Asynchronous backing, technical name, but it essentially just means that we're decreasing the block times from 12 seconds to 6 seconds, and also increasing the amount of transaction data that can fit in each block by 4 times. So essentially a 8x throughput increase. I believe with this that a single one of these parachains will be able to achieve transactions per second of roughly Solana. TPS is kind of a useless metric. There's lots of ways you can game it. There's a presentation from a Polkadot core dev where he tweaked a couple things and he took a parachain from 1,000 transactions per second to 83,000. So it's not exactly a great metric, but essentially one of these parachains can be as scalable as Solana. And the end goal is to have a couple hundred of these running on Polkadot at the same time.
And Zach, what are a couple examples of some of the parachains? Like, I know you guys are focused quite a bit on specific like enterprise verticals. Could you throw out a few examples?
Yeah, I'll get to some more of those later. Obviously, we have DeFi focused chains such as Hydration Network. They're kind of building a full vertical DeFi stack, so decentralized exchange, lending market, stablecoin, and that's it's really custom built for that, so it scales very well. Another example is Social Chain, the project I used to work at, Subsocial. That was basically trying to build a social layer for the internet to solve a lot of the problems with centralized social networks that we see, such as Facebook, Instagram. Other things like Kilt, they're building decentralized identifiers, so people can kind of own their data. You think if you go to the club, the bouncer wants to see your ID just to verify how old you are. Well, now he knows your address, how tall you are, whatever. Really, he doesn't even need to know how old you are. He just needs to know that you're old enough to enter. So with DIDs, you can do all that sort of thing. So I'll touch on all that a bit more later.
Yeah, I mean, DIDs are pivotal, right? Like a lot of the things outside of public blockchains, anytime you're touching anything to do with the government or a lot of the other like functions in sort of the public sector business world, a lot of those run into trouble without effective decentralized identifiers or effective, self-sovereign identity. So good call out there.
Definitely. And so the third part of Polkadot 2.0 is elastic scaling, which basically means that you can use multiple core times to lower the block times even farther. So the cores have 6-second block times, but if you use 2 cores, you can kind of offset them a little bit to get 3-second block times. Or if you want 1-second blocks, then you can use 6 cores. So theoretically, you could scale this to even using 30 or 40 cores if you want and get incredibly short block times, where ultimately you'll just be limited by physical hardware limitations of how fast the nodes can actually run. But just mentioning that if you're building some business use case where you need super fast block times, it will be possible with Polkadot 2.0. So rewinding a bit to this visual here, we have these different cores. The different colored blocks you can think of as different parachains, different applications running on top of Polkadot. So the light green one, for example, it starts on core N and then it switches to core 2 and it keeps running no problem. The light blue one, for example, there's 2 blocks in the middle where it doesn't exist. Maybe you didn't have any transactions there, so it doesn't need to pay for block space. And then once there are transactions in these last 3 blocks here, it picks back up. So it's really flexible. You can get exactly as much or as little as you need, scale as much as you need, speed, not a concern. So ultimately, Polkadot is one of the best solutions so far at solving the blockchain trilemma, which basically means that of security, scalability, and decentralization, you can have 2, but you have to sacrifice the third. So Bitcoin and Ethereum are great examples of high security and decentralization, but they're not very scalable. What Polkadot does is the Polkadot relay chain is very secure and decentralized, and then the parachains ultimately provide the scalability, and they are decentralized as well, but they're not sacrificing security, they're just passing it to the Polkadot relay chain. So it all works, pretty great. So as I mentioned, Polkadot has 297 validators with a proof of stake system to provide security. Those validators are globally distributed, and control of the network is based on the DOT token, which is very decentralized as well. I believe the highest non-exchange account is owned by the Web3 Foundation, and it only has about 2% of the token supply. So it's pretty good compared to something like Dogecoin, where one account has 1/3 of the tokens.
Let's double hit on that. Okay, so the Web3 Foundation, which is the largest DOT token holder, has 2% of.
Yeah, somewhere around there.
That is fantastic.
And a large portion of that right now is actually the voting power of it is delegated to community members and groups, which I'll touch on in a bit.
No, it's even more decentralized than that.
Yeah.
Some of these other chains are, just exactly. I mean, that really gets to what we're talking about with FIT21 and the spectrum of decentralization, and what might be a commodity or utility digital asset and what might be a security. So fascinating.
Yeah, the Web3 Foundation has spent a couple years working with the SEC and getting a definition from the SEC of when a security morphs into a software, so to speak. Um, and according to that definition, Polkadot has become a software as soon as the full decentralized governance system launched last year. So that's a big part of it, really focusing on decentralization. So why Polkadot? What does it bring to the table? Why should anybody care about this? I have a couple points here. The first is shared security is perhaps the most important. It really allows for this multi-chain world where the chains can communicate. As I mentioned before, chains talking to each other, that requires a lot of trust, and we're trying to minimize trust. If I ask you to go into a room with 100 people and trust all of them, that's a pretty big ask. But if I ask you to just trust one person, that's much easier. With this setup, the parachains only have to trust the relay chain. And because there's a trust connection between each parachain and the relay chain, it essentially carries over. So the parachains can kind of trust each other by proxy, just by having their security provided by the relay chain. Additionally, it provides easy access to billions of dollars of security. With proof of stake, security is kind of a measure of the value of the network. If you're launching a new proof of stake chain and the network's not worth very much, the cost to buy enough tokens to attack the network is very low. But if you launch a project and connect on Polkadot, you instantly have billions of dollars of security where it's just not really feasible to attack the network. Someone would have to take over like 150 validators around the world or buy, 51% of the tokens, which right now 58% of them are staked. So you wouldn't even be able to do that if you tried.
Yeah, and
Okay.
also when you start trying to buy that number of tokens, I mean, the
Yeah,
lack,
the price will go way up.
yeah, the lack of liquidity, you start running into like an impossibility type situation.
Yeah, so at this point, Polkadot's pretty much impossible to attack, impossible to stop. It's so decentralized, and with the governance system, it really is incredibly resilient. And Polkadot also provides very high quality block space. There's a overabundance of block space in the world right now. We have so many different blockchains, they're all producing blocks, but how secure are those blocks? How scalable and flexible are they? What can you actually do with them? For example, Bitcoin, there's not a whole lot you can do with them. On Ethereum, there's a decent amount you can do. You're still kind of limited by smart contracts, and it's not that scalable. So Polkadot, using the Polkadot SDK, which I'll touch on, lets you do pretty much anything that you can think of, and it's scalable and it's flexible and it's very, very low cost. The Polkadot SDK that I just mentioned was built by Gavin Wood and his team at Parity as kind of a framework for building modular blockchains. So you can think of it as kind of having Legos. There's these things called pallets, which you can think of it as Legos, and they already exist. And if you want to build something, you just take some of them and put them together, and boom, you have a chain. So examples of pallets include treasury, governance, profiles, account identities, decentralized identifiers, DEX. So lots of these things that you can kind of take and just put together, um, where you can even build a chain in an hour or less. Also, with building one of these custom chains, you can do lots of cool things like have custom tokenomics. Do we want to have transaction fees get burnt? Should they go to the treasury? Maybe we burn half of them and send the other half to the treasury. Fee structures, transaction priority, which I think is a really big one. For example, on financial chains, there's some things that need to happen when they need to happen. And if the chain's congested and they just happen at the end, you can have bad consequences. So you can prioritize different types of transactions earlier in blocks so that the important things get done when they need to be done. And finally, I'll touch on a really cool feature, proxies, which are similar to account abstraction, if you've heard that term. This basically allows you to let another account sign transactions on your behalf, but you can specify which types of transactions. So we had a really cool feature at Subsocial with this where you could essentially create a social proxy, we called it, where it could sign transactions on your behalf for making a post, leaving a comment, liking a post, things that aren't really that big of a deal if someone hacks into that account and they can post for you. But the proxy couldn't actually transfer tokens. So you can retain security for the things that actually matter, but get a better user experience for things that don't need as much security. Nobody wants to go on Twitter and constantly have a wallet pop up every time they like something. So it really gives you lots of flexibility in terms of different security levels and how much convenience you want. Touch on Kusama real quick. This is often misunderstood. It's essentially Polkadot's sister or cousin. The analogy is a canary in a coal mine, which if you're not familiar with that, it was miners would be in a coal mine. They might hit a gas pocket. They can't smell it, but if they stay down there, they'll die from the gas. So they would have a canary down there in a cage, which would constantly be chirping. If it stopped chirping, then they could figure out, oh, there's gas, we need to get out. As a side note, I think the bird would usually survive. So Kusama is essentially people think of it as a test net for Polkadot, which it is in some sense, but it's a real value test net. The problem with test nets is nobody really uses them. Developers use them a little bit to test things, but hackers aren't trying to hack stuff on the test nets. Real users aren't stress testing these things. So you need to have some actual real value. So any new changes to Polkadot, they get rolled out on Kusama first, which does have real value. It has actual projects there and actual users. And so we've had lots of cases so far where things break on Kusama and not on Polkadot. So it's really good. And we started to see, the Ethereum community and others start to talk about, maybe we actually do need this real value test environment. So this just farther enhances Polkadot's, security in terms of technical bugs. Building a Polkadot lets you really specialize in an ecosystem, as I was talking about before. A lot of these chains are sort of jack of all trades, but they're the master of none. And if you really want to do one thing and do it really well, Polkadot is the place to be. The other option is just kind of building a solo chain that's just out somewhere and it's not connected to anything. And then you have to use bridges to sort of connect to the rest of the crypto ecosystem. And bridges aren't very good. So by building out Polkadot, you can really specialize, but then still be part of a thriving ecosystem with lots of other things that might be valuable to your project, even though you're not building like identities or a decentralized exchange. And of course, this gives you possibly lower congestion. There's been cases on Ethereum where a big NFT collection is having a mint and gas fees spike up to $100. And if I'm just trying to do something on Uniswap, all of a sudden it costs $100 to sell some tokens. Well, if we have the NFTs on one chain and the decentralized exchange on another chain, there's not going to be any cross impact there. Side note about energy efficiency, Polkadot is very efficient. Right now, the whole network uses about 16 US households worth of energy, and that's with around 50 blockchains so far. We're planning to scale to a couple hundred, as I mentioned. So it'll essentially get increasingly energy efficient because most of the nodes in the network are the 297 Polkadot validators. Each parachain has a couple collators, which you can also think of as sequencers. They're the ones that take the transactions and build the blocks, but then they send the blocks to Polkadot to get validated. So adding a new chain to the network only increases the node count by, maybe 5, as opposed to the 297 validators already. So it'll get increasingly energy efficient in terms of, the energy cost to run one blockchain. Security and decentralization, obviously a very big thing. There's a concept known as the Nakamoto coefficient, which is essentially how many entities would it take to attack the network. Polkadot has a Nakamoto coefficient of 89 right now, and this does change fairly regularly. It's also not an exact science. It's kind of hard to know how many nodes does each entity own because things are a little pseudonymous. But among all of the big blockchain networks, Polkadot is the highest by far. For example, Ethereum is just 1. Binance and Polygon are 4, Solana is 20, and Avalanche is 22. So, how many entities would you have to take over the network? 89 at the moment for Polkadot, so not very feasible. And lastly, perhaps what I think is the coolest about the Polkadot, and this is really a feature of the Polkadot SDK, is future-proof upgradability. So if you're using the Polkadot SDK, there's no forking the blockchain to upgrades. To upgrade the chain. So with Bitcoin, if they want to do something, they have to fork the blockchain. This involves somehow getting consensus from all the miners, setting a date that they want to do the fork, distributing the new software, and then everybody has to upgrade. It's very complex. With Polkadot, we can propose to upgrade the chain, put it to a proposal in governance. Token holders have 4 weeks to vote on it. If it passes, then the chain just automatically upgrades itself. In most cases, the validator nodes, they don't even have to do anything either. It just automatically upgrades automatically. So this is very nice for future proof. We can constantly ship new features, iterate. If you're building on top of Polkadot using the Polkadot SDK, this is also great. If you're building a DeFi chain, you can just constantly add new things, new features, versus having to, ship new smart contracts and then migrate everything, all of the liquidity and the users, the UI, move everything over to the new smart contracts. And as I mentioned, this happens through governance, and we have even upgraded the governance system already. So it's pretty cool. So let's talk about the on-chain governance for the world's biggest DAO, which is Polkadot. I believe at the moment Polkadot has somewhere around 1.3 million token holders. If you Google the world's biggest DAO, you won't find Polkadot anywhere on any of the lists for some reason. The number one usually is Uniswap, which has a couple 100,000 token holders, but not that many. And if you ask in terms of market capitalization as well, Polkadot is at the top. So how does Polkadot governance work? It is on-chain and self-enacting, which I wish I didn't have to highlight, but I do because so many of these projects that talk about having governance and being decentralized, their governance is not actually self-enacting. It's still ultimately very centralized. So on Polkadot, when we have a proposal and it passes, the chain just does it automatically. Like Lee was saying, for the Treasury proposal to partner Polkadot with TBC, once it passed, the dot was just automatically sent to TBC's wallet. There wasn't any centralized group of people in an office somewhere that said, okay, people voted yes on this, so let's send this dot here. It just happened automatically. Upgrading the chain, for example, that happens automatically as well following the vote. So there's no centralized body that can say yes or no, compared to other chains, for example, where they'll put things up for a vote, but then it's ultimately up to this small group of people to decide what's actually going to happen. That's not decentralized at all. It's super easy to attack, coerce these people into doing something, because it's not actually auto-enacting. So people vote with their dot tokens. They can increase their voting power by locking up their tokens for more time. We call this conviction voting. If you really believe in the network, then you should be willing to lock your tokens up for longer if you want to have a higher say in a vote. The system is very flexible. As I mentioned, we've already upgraded it a few times. We also have delegation. So right now we probably average 1 to 2 new proposals every day. So it's a lot to keep up with. So you can delegate your vote to somebody else. We have lots of examples of this already. There's also, it's not implemented yet, but I think it will be soon, sort of agile delegations where if I delegate my votes to you, my votes will follow your vote. But if there's a specific proposal that we disagree on, I can change my vote for that specific proposal, which frankly, I would love to see this implemented in, kind of United States government, but not there yet. And
Zach,
finally,
do you guys ever do ranked choice voting?
not familiar with that.
Okay,
No.
it's like if there's multiple options in a proposal, people can instead of just voting for their most favorite, they can rank the choices, and then an algorithm gives the most favorite option
Okay.
amongst all of it.
Yeah, I
It's
do think that would be useful. A lot of times we have a discussion phase first so people can kind of, talk, figure out what the best option is, because ultimately at the moment it is just yes or no for things. But that would be a cool thing to add in the future for sure.
I think I mean, it's similar to quadratic voting, but slightly different. But Yeah,
Mhm.
something to think about as you engage with the community.
Yeah, I might propose that. I imagine it would be kind of complicated for them to implement, but definitely interesting. And finally, we have multiple governance tracks. So, for example, upgrading the code of the chain is a much more serious matter than, if we want to tip somebody $50 for making a nice video. So these different tracks ultimately allow for, more oversight, get more eyes on the important things, versus, smaller things. They're easier to pass quickly, don't need as much scrutiny. So here's two visuals visualizing the root track, which is the highest level track that can do anything on the chain, versus the small tipper track, which I believe can tip 100 DOT to someone. So we have two parameters in governance. First is approval, which is of the people that have voted, how many said yes and how many said no. And second is support, which is how many tokens have voted out of all of the tokens that exist. Historically, support is only around 1 to 2%, but we have seen a couple of proposals that have gotten over 10% for, very serious things. So you can see here that both of these, they trend towards 50% approval and 0% support over time. This essentially just means that if something is really important on the root track, for example, and if it gets a lot of votes, it can pass much faster. Otherwise, it may just have to wait longer, but this gives us more time to have more eyes on it. The small tipper track, it trends towards 0 as well, but much faster. So, you don't have to wait 4 weeks to tip somebody for making a video. It can happen a lot faster. There's also a couple other things such as bounties and collectives. So a bounty you can kind of think of as a sub-treasury that has curators. A good example is the events bounty that we have right now. We don't want to constantly have tons of proposals for events. Most people aren't really experts on what makes a good event, what goes into it, auditing costs and this sort of thing. So we have this event bounty, which was proposed to basically create this sub-treasury, fund it with DOT from the main treasury, and then elect curators, kind of experts on events to oversee that. If you want to host an event, you can submit a proposal to the event bounty, and those curators can review it. So this is kind of more centralized, but allows for specialized knowledge. Of course, we've already seen examples of Polkadot proposals to replace some of the curators on the bounty. If voters are not happy with the job they're doing, we can replace them at any time.
You guys have a
So
bug bounty as well, Zach?
uh, I'm not sure, but I would say 99% yes. I don't know if it would be called a bug bounty specifically, but I'm sure there is something like that. I know a lot of the parachains do as well.
Did you hear about the recent bug bounty for Kraken where someone who's a white hat hacker exploited it, like
Yeah,
didn't give the money back, but still wanted to claim the bounty? It was kind of a crazy situation.
yeah, I think it turned out that it was Certic that hacked them actually,
Yeah,
the auditing
that's
company.
the name of the company. It definitely a bad look for the industry and for that company.
Yeah. So I don't know if there's officially a bounty for that, but I'm quite certain that either if there's not something on chain, then there's something through Parity or the Web3 Foundation, or the Polkadot Technical Fellowship, perhaps, which is an example of a collective, which you can kind of think of as a sub DAO or an on-chain organization. But these are codified, so to speak. So we have a collectives palette, one of those Lego bricks I was talking about earlier. So you can create a collective for anything you want. And this is kind of similar to a bounty, but a little different. It can have its own treasury, so to speak, and elect members, kind of create its own bylaws. So the Polkadot Technical Fellowship is the first example of one of these. Is created to essentially maintain and steward the Polkadot protocol and sort of manage the runtime, the upgrades, develop changes, review any changes to make sure there's no bugs happening. And it's ultimately funded by the treasury. So the Polkadot DAO is basically paying for a group of developers that are dedicated to developing Polkadot. A really cool thing here is that how they're actually funded is the Polkadot treasury is taking DOT. It's sending it to one of the parachains hydration network that I mentioned earlier, where it's DCAing it into stable coins over time, which then gets sent to the Polkadot Technical Fellowship Treasury. So those developers can get paid in stable coins from the Polkadot Treasury, slowly scaling out of DOT into those stable coins. So finally, let's talk about the ecosystem a little bit. We've got lots of different sort of verticals: DeFi, NFTs, social identity, decentralized physical infrastructure, real world assets, although I've heard that's kind of a bad term, storage and compute, of course. So lots of different things going on, people trying to solve real world problems, onboard more people to the financial internet, and make the world a better place ultimately. In the ecosystem, right now we have over 50 chains on Polkadot. Some of them are system chains. These are essentially common good chains that Polkadot governance has decided, okay, we will give the system good chains access to core time on Polkadot free of charge. And these system chains use DOT as the fee token. So it's not like there's a team that has their own token and they did raises with VCs. The purpose of these system chains is essentially to move all of the functionality from the relay chain off the relay chain onto these system chains. So what does that mean? Is that ultimately the relay chain should have 0 transactions per second, which is kind of a crazy thing to say, like everyone wants the most TPS that they can get. But on the relay chain, we want to have 0 transactions because its sole purpose, its specialization is providing security for the ecosystem. It shouldn't be burdened with staking, governance, managing assets and identities. It should just be validating blocks. And then we use these parachains to actually manage, governance, staking, that sort of thing. So I think that full move of everything off the relay chain is still quite a ways away. But that is the ultimate goal and sort of a great example for highlighting the ideas here. And finally, there are some standalone chains that use the Polkadot SDK. So they wanted to build a modular blockchain, make use of palettes, all these customizable things, but they're not running on top of Polkadot yet. They have their own security. But the cool thing is that any of these chains can decide to move on to Polkadot at any time if they want to become part of the ecosystem. Some of the parachains do have a EVM palette, so this lets you use MetaMask. People can deploy smart contracts, bridge over from Ethereum, and ultimately they won't even know that they're using a Polkadot chain, but they get the scalability advantages and are part of the ecosystem. So we've got a number of app chains, which they're basically parachains that just have one app for now. We're expecting to see a lot of those get more as third-party developer teams come and say, okay, this chain has all of these primitives, these features. Here's a cool idea that I can build for an application that the original team hasn't thought of yet. And of course, there are general purpose chains, that have the EVM implemented, or other types of smart contracts as well, using Ink or WASM to really let people do anything they want. Moving between these different parachains, cross-chaining, it takes less than 12 seconds. And it's practically free. The fee is so low. If you contrast that to, moving between Ethereum and Solana maybe, where it takes 15, 20, 30 minutes or more and can cost tens or hundreds of dollars. It's just night and day difference. Every time I go use like a sort of old school bridge, I'm just flabbergasted that people are okay with using those. It's so bad. Polkadot wallets are pretty great. They're built for a multi-chain world. So they show all of your assets on all these different chains. They connect to all of the chains. Contrast that to MetaMask. You want to switch between Ethereum layer 2s, you have to open the wallet, switch which network you're on. It's not built for connecting to multiple chains. And perhaps more importantly is in Polkadot, we don't have any blind signing. When you go to do a transaction, you can actually see what it is you're trying to do. In Ethereum, you interact with a smart contract or something. You can see the transaction data, but it's just hexadecimal. It's not readable to your average user at all. There's been examples where hackers will hack a application. They don't change anything. They don't make it look any different. But I think I'm swapping some tokens. I sign the transaction, and then my account gets drained because I wasn't actually doing a swap transaction. I was click and confirm to send all of my tokens to the hacker's website because they changed, what the transaction actually is. And I, as a user, can't tell at all. If I can actually see the transaction data, then I can see if am I doing a swap or am I doing a balance transfer. So from a security standpoint, it's much better, very important. Here I have links to apps and some ecosystem wallets. If you want to come open the slide deck later and look at those. We also have the Polkadot Developer Console. I don't know of any other ecosystem that has something like this. The average user probably should never look at this. It's kind of complicated, but if you are a power user, it's incredibly cool. It lets you really dig down into any chain. You can go look at every single pallet, see every type of transaction you can do. You can manually submit transactions. If there's something cool you want to do, you don't have to wait for someone to build a website. You can go in and select the type of transaction you want to do and put the data in yourself, as well as seeing governance stuff, staking, and lots of other things. So it's very cool, and lets even non-technical power users essentially kind of level up their skills a bit. So ultimately, Polkadot is the most scalable, future-proof, and decentralized blockchain ecosystem that's out there, really positioning itself to be the go-to place for real businesses that want to build blockchain-based applications where you won't have to worry about hitting a scalability limit, having slow transactions, you won't be overpaying for block space that you're not using, and you don't ever have to worry about the chain shutting down or being attacked by some government or something somewhere. It's very unstoppable, resilient, customizable, and flexible. Looking forward, there's a thing called JAM, which Dr. Gavin Wood has been touring around recently talking about. I don't want to touch on it too much. It's pretty technical, but essentially this will, as I understand it, really be the world computer. The idea is that you'll be able to take any computer code, like any program you might use in your everyday life, like Excel, and sort of put this on this world computer and run it in a decentralized fashion. So if you have any questions about any of that, you want to know more, you can definitely send me an email here at zacharyjedwards@outlook.com or find me on Twitter at CryptoCowboyOG. Email is probably better than Twitter DM. Those kind of get lost sometimes, but would love to talk more, answer any questions, share any extra resources for anybody that's curious.
That's awesome, Zach. We really appreciate you coming on and educating us. A little bit different podcast than we normally do, more of a webinar format, if you will. But I think it's important when we have these technical things to have the visual examples and the aids for folks. So again, definitely a good one for folks to watch on YouTube rather than just listen to. And yeah, if you need to reach out to Zach, you see where his email is, and he'll be advocating for and educating in the Texas ecosystem and then across the United States in the years to come. So thanks for coming on the show, Zach.
Thanks for having me.